Why is there so much fighting inside of the Talmud, and how could it possibly be holy if the rabbis can't seem to agree on anything? That's a question that a Christian recently asked me, and I want to address it. It's fantastic. But before we answer this question, I guess I first have to describe what the Talmud actually is. You see, in previous videos, we've spoken about how the Jewish people have an oral tradition from Mount Sinai, and how this oral tradition has been passed down from father to son, from teacher to student, in an unbroken chain of transmission since Mount Sinai, and that without this oral tradition, it's impossible to fulfill the commandments inside of the Bible. This tradition was never put into writing up until around the year 200 of the Common Era, when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, son of the Davidic dynasty, a brilliant mind and a very holy man, realized that the Jewish people were standing at the cusp of a very dark era, and he went around to the different heads of the yeshivas and he compiled their notes into what is called the Mishnah. Now, what was actually happening in the world at the time? What forced him to do this? The Romans were not very nice to the Jewish people at that point in time, to put it mildly. Our children were sold into brothels, our women as slaves, our men by the tens of thousands. They built the Colosseum, and then their broken and emaciated bodies were thrown into the pit of the Colosseum while crowds jeered and cheered, watching these people be torn apart by wild animals. Our sages, many of them suffered horrific deaths, like Rabbi Akiva, who was flayed alive with iron combs that ripped the flesh and the skin from his body. It was a horrific time. Jews were spread throughout the empire, communities and families broken apart. I could cry just even thinking about it. The Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi realized that the chain of transmission was incredible danger. People didn't have their rabbis with them. People were alone in the diaspora. He compiled the Mishnah, and the Mishnah was then given out to the various communities to enable them, even when they were far away from the teachers, to be able to continue learning the oral tradition. A few hundred years later, the Gemara was compiled. This was a discussion between some of the greatest minds in history. They discussed the Mishnah, they discussed the Oral Torah, how to apply it to every single situation. That's what the Talmud is. There are also Baraisas and Midrashim and Toseftas. This oral tradition, in all of its various forms, is studied in yeshivas even to this very day. And it enables us to maintain this chain of transmission and to know how to apply the oral tradition to any situation that comes up in life. Every time there's a new invention, we can use the methodology that we learned from the Talmud. We can use the principles that we learned from the Talmud, and we can apply it to modern day situations, because the Torah is a living Torah, and we have to know how to understand whatever life brings at us. So what kind of fighting will you find inside of the Talmud that this Christian was referencing? All of the rabbis agree that one of the ways to marry a woman is to give her a gift with the intent of marrying her, and if she accepts it, then she becomes his wife. But the question is what if he gives her something of very tiny value? Like, what is the cutoff point? Is it $1? Is it a quarter? Is it a nickel? Is it a dime? Is it a penny? What? They go back and forth discussing all the various different situations, analyzing everything. You'll have situations in which the rabbis are discussing, if somebody left a jug in the middle of the road, is he responsible if another person comes and trips over it? So one person will say, obviously. The next person will say, well, the second person should have seen where he was going. So another rabbi is going to pop in and say, but if it was dark, he couldn't see where he was going. They're going to analyze everything from all different angles to arrive at the correct solution. The things that they're fighting about are not massive issues. They're hair splitting. These are tiny, tiny little details. All of the big issues, such as the nature of God, nobody's even discussing that, such as how many gods there are, how many forms he takes. Everybody agrees God is one. It's not even a question. So when we say that the rabbis are arguing, it's not that they're tearing themselves up over massive theological issues. They're hair splitting in order to arrive at the correct definition of anything that life could possibly throw at them. That's what it's about. Most importantly is, even after these rabbis sat and they discussed these issues, they still went home and they ate supper together, or their children married each other's children. There was no animosity between them. There was peace. Even if they disagreed with each other's reasoning, there was peace. Christianity, on the other hand, it was always discussion of the big issues. And if people didn't agree on the big issues, it often turned into a very bloody situation. So in early Christianity, people couldn't decide if Jesus was God, or if he was man, or if he was just an apparition, or like, what was he? They couldn't even decide if he was one of one, one of three, one of 300. Finally, at the Council of Nicaea, Jesus was decided to be as the same substance as the Father. And in 381 CE, the Holy Spirit was elevated to the triune Godship. And okay, fine, the Trinity thing got figured out, except for the fact that People still didn't agree on that 100%, but anybody who didn't agree on that was labeled a heretic by the orthodoxy of the church. And some people, allegedly, lost their lives because of this. Moving further on into history, you had so many different factions of Christianity that were fighting against each other, killing each other literally, such as Calvin. Calvin had Michael Servetus, who disagreed with the Trinity, murdered. Servetus was one of the great contributors to science. He discovered the pulmonary system. He was a fantastic doctor. But because he disagreed about the nature of the Trinity, well, he was killed. And he wasn't killed in a particularly painless manner either. People like Calvin were the spiritual leaders of the church. And then you had the 30-year war in which the Catholics and the Protestants were trying to kill each other off. And then the Protestants and the Catholics, they both wanted to get rid of the Anabaptists, and they slaughtered them indiscriminately. Why? Because the major theological issues, such as the nature of God, the nature of sin, the nature of salvation, all of these were debated. These were things that people were picking and choosing what they wanted to believe. And anybody who believed differently, well, they were deserving of death. Nowadays, we don't necessarily see Christians physically killing each other, but all you have to do is read through the comment section of any YouTube or Instagram video to see the different Christian minds that come along and tear each other apart about the very theological differences that they have. You're not a real Christian, one will say to another, but you're not a real Christian, you're an idolater. The fights go back and forth and back and forth. And it's totally understandable because everybody's reading the New Testament however they want to read it. You see, this document has so many contradictory viewpoints inside of it. Let me give you a couple examples. In Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council decides that Gentile Christians should refrain from eating meat that's offered to idolatry or meat that has been strangled. Whereas if you go over to Paul's letters in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and in Romans 14, he's all like, you can eat whatever you want. If you don't believe in idolatry, then it's fine. You can have that. Everything is fine. So you'll have Christians who say, we don't eat things that are strangled. And you'll have Christians who say, you can eat whatever you want. You'll have Christians who say, Jesus said not a jot or a tittle will pass away. And then you'll have Christians who say, Paul said everything went away. It decayed. It's gone. It's withered away. And if you're going to try to keep commandments like circumcision, well, you might as well just cut the whole thing off. I mean, come on, you guys can't agree on anything. And it makes total sense because everything is contradictory. You'll have viewpoints from all across the spectrum. You'll have stories told about Jesus, who is supposedly God, who was tested for 40 days in the wilderness. And then James is going to chime in and he's going to say, God can't be tested. So tell me, which is it? Is Jesus God and God be tested? Or can God not be tested? Where Jesus is not God? Like, hello? It is so easy to develop theologies that are vastly disparate from one another if your theology comes from the New Testament. Every faction of Christianity is literally using pick and choose polemics. You're finding things that bolster your beliefs and you're holding on to it as your path to salvation. And if somebody doesn't agree with you, well, they're not a real Christian. The only way to know what God really wants of us is to get back to the original. Go back into the Tanakh. Learn, and learn. Evaluate all claims against it. Is Christianity truly the path to salvation? Is that truly the way to know who God is? Is it truly God's will for the world? You won't know this if you're looking at the world through a Christological lens. You can only know what is true by going back to the original and evaluating all claims against that.